Parliamentary chambers have always been places of fire, where tempers flare, voices rise, and egos collide. South Africans know this rhythm of political theatre all too well. The shouting matches, the angry walkouts, the scandals splashed across the headlines. But this week, something happened that broke the script, something the nation had not witnessed in decades. It wasn't the usual noise of insults traded across the aisle, nor another routine clash between the ruling party and the opposition. This was heavier. This was darker. It was a moment that made even the most jaded citizens sit up, lean closer to their screens, and whisper, "Wait, what just happened?" At the center of the storm stood one man, Gayton McKenzie, leader of the Patriotic Alliance. He has built his political identity on blunt words, bold gestures, and theatrical stunts that cut through the noise of South Africa's politics. Known as unpredictable, unfiltered, and unafraid, McKenzie thrives on disruption. Yet on this day, even by his own dramatic standards, he unleashed something staggering, something that turned Parliament into a stage of chaos and transformed the entire nation into an audience holding its breath. The cameras zoomed in as McKenzie rose from his seat. Not quickly, not nervously, but with deliberate slowness, each step measured like a man carrying dynamite. The chamber fell eerily still. ANC benches stiffened. Opposition MPs leaned forward in anticipation. Even the speaker, sensing the weight of what was about to happen, froze mid-motion. Then Mackenzie's voice rang out, steady, sharp, slicing through the silence. "I have in my possession an international arrest warrant for President Cyril Ramaphosa." The chamber gasped. The country stopped. And in that single sentence, South African politics was thrown into a storm no one could control. Gasps rippled through the chamber as MPs froze in disbelief. Others bent toward each other, whispering furiously. The speaker banged the gavel, calling for order, but the order was already gone. For citizens watching live, it was a moment that made even the most cynical lean closer, unable to look away. The ANC benches erupted in fury, shouting McKenzie down. But the opposition roared back, emboldened by the spectacle. The speaker shouted herself hoarse, but the tension in the air was volcanic. Then came the unthinkable. One by one, entire rows of MPs shoved back their chairs, the screech of wood against floor echoing through the chamber. Their footsteps thundered as they marched out in protest. A walkout, a rebellion, a message louder than any speech. Parliament was no longer united behind its president. What was this so-called warrant? McKenzie, holding the document high, claimed it was tied to illicit international transactions, dubious financial deals, breaches of both South African and international law. The charges were explosive. And whether the paper he waved was legally binding or merely symbolic hardly mattered. The symbolism alone struck at the very heart of the presidency. This was not just an attack on Ramaphosa the man, it was an attack on the office he holds. The walkout wasn't just a gesture. It was a political earthquake. Opposition MPs pounced like wolves, chanting "Resign! Resign!" and demanding Ramaphosa's immediate suspension. They shouted that in any functioning democracy, such an allegation would end a presidency overnight. The ANC benches fought back, loyalists dismissing McKenzie's so-called warrant as nothing more than a publicity stunt. But their voices were drowned in the chaos. The sight of MPs streaming out of Parliament carried far more weight than any defense. For ordinary South Africans watching on live television, it felt less like a parliamentary debate and more like a government collapsing in real time. This was not a spur-of-the-moment eruption. It was carefully staged political theatre, a masterstroke in timing and drama. McKenzie, the outsider-turned-disruptor, had lobbed a grenade into the heart of Parliament. Analysts were divided. Some condemned him as reckless, accusing him of dragging Parliament's reputation through the mud for the sake of headlines. Others hailed him as the man who finally pierced the ANC's wall of secrecy, daring to say aloud what millions of South Africans had been whispering for years: enough is enough. Either way, one fact was undeniable. McKenzie had altered the national conversation. For decades, the ANC carried itself like a fortress, unshakable, immovable, untouchable. But this episode exposed cracks too deep for slogans to cover. Behind closed doors, whispers grew louder. Senior ANC leaders weren't just angry at McKenzie, they were furious at Ramaphosa himself, blaming his weak leadership for leaving the party exposed. Scandal after scandal had chipped away at the ANC's grip. Grassroots supporters, once fiercely loyal, began asking themselves difficult questions. Was McKenzie reckless, or was he right? For many citizens, his theatrics were not an embarrassment but a relief. At last, someone stood up to power. And what of the man at the eye of the storm, Cyril Ramaphosa? Through the shouting, through the walkout, through the chaos, he remained seated, calm, silent. His face was unreadable. But silence cuts both ways. His critics called it the silence of guilt, proof that the allegation struck too close to the truth. His defenders insisted it was the silence of dignity, refusing to be dragged into theater. Yet to the wider world, it looked like something worse, paralysis. The timing could not have been worse. Ramaphosa was already struggling to keep his presidency afloat amid corruption scandals, economic turmoil, and a restless public. Now this. Demands for independent inquiries grew louder. Civil society was stirring. Opposition parties smelled blood. And the ANC was left not just defending its president, but its very legitimacy as South Africa's ruling party. As for Gayton McKenzie, with one theatrical move he stepped from the shadows of outsider politics into the mainstream. Love him or hate him, he had changed the game. And whether or not the paper he held in Parliament ever proves to be real, one thing is undeniable. South African politics will never be the same again. This was not just another day in Parliament. It was a moment of destiny. A warrant waved like a sword. A walkout that thundered like an earthquake. And a president's silence that echoed like a warning. South Africa now stands at a crossroads. One road leads to accountability, reform, and leaders worthy of the people. The other leads to chaos, mistrust, and collapse. And the question that hangs heavy in the air is this. Will Cyril Ramaphosa face the storm head-on? Or will history remember him as the man who stayed silent while his presidency crumbled around him?